Imagine living in a place where you must ask yourself every day, how can I live here when I can't afford housing? How can I be healthy when the food is lousy? These are not rhetorical questions. They're real. They come from the lyrics of Setanak, an Inuit rapper from Nunavut, Canada. In her territory, close to 7 in 10 residents face food insecurity. 14 people may share a 4-bedroom home. Poverty here means a daily struggle for survival in one of the world's harshest regions. Yet, this crisis remains largely invisible to most of us. While poverty studies have extensively examined urban American poverty, rural poverty within developing nations, and the impacts of globalization on vulnerable populations, we have systemically neglected the compounding poverty crisis facing Arctic Indigenous peoples. This crisis combines three devastating forces: historical colonialism, contemporary economic marginalization, and accelerating climate change, creating a perfect storm that threatens entire ways of life. Today, I want to convince you that we must urgently address Arctic Indigenous poverty. Why? Because it represents profound moral failure stemming from centuries of colonial oppression. And because climate change is rapidly amplifying existing inequities in ways that threaten cultural survival, food security, and mental health of communities that have sustainably inhabited these regions for millennia. Their experience reveals how environmental injustice and economic injustice are fundamentally inseparable in our warming world. Understanding poverty in Arctic Indigenous communities requires abandoning the notion that poverty concerns income levels alone. As Duncan explains, poverty discussions span economic poverty and cultural poverty, and in Indigenous Arctic contexts, these forms are deeply intertwined. Ethnomusicologist Harrison and philosopher Poge have examined relationships between colonialism and poverty, recognizing that Indigenous poverty cannot be separated from both its historical and political roots. Arctic communities face what researcher Harrison terms physiological deprivation of the requirements for meeting basic human needs, including food, shelter, and health services, while simultaneously experiencing the erosion of cultural practices, traditional knowledge systems, and connections to the land that have sustained them for generations. Consider the specific manifestations of poverty in Nunavut. Foods have to be flown in or shipped into the territory, and close to 7 in 10 residents face food insecurities according to the Nunavut Food Security Coalition. Food insecurity scholar Compton defines this as a condition in which the availability of nutritionally adequate food and safe food, or the ability to acquire such foods in manners which are socially acceptable, is limited or uncertain due to financial constraints. The financial barrier proves staggering. Geographic isolation and transportation costs to remote Arctic communities mean that basic groceries can cost 2 to 3 times their price as compared to southern Canada. Families attempting to maintain adequate nutrition face impossible choices between food and other necessities. Housing presents equally dire circumstances. Former Nunavut MP Moila Kakak demonstrated cases of 14 people living in a 4-bedroom home and noted that a report aimed to raise awareness and to humanize the housing crisis in Nunavut, an issue typically represented through statistics. Kokak's observations reveal the racialized nature of this crisis. She has never met a non-Inuk living in a home with obvious mold, and everyone she encountered facing so many barriers, housing being a major one, was Inuk. These overcrowded conditions create what researcher Sulia and colleagues term crowded living conditions, which significantly impact both physical and mental health outcomes for adults and children. Mental health care access further compounds these challenges. Setanak articulates this barrier within her music. How can we live here when we don't have support? How can we be heard if we're being ignored? In interviews, she elaborates, "Up here, it's hard to get proper mental health help. It feels like for us to heal, we have to work like 10 times harder than other people." These structural barriers include the reality that a lot of the counselors tend to come here and then leave, and they have to start all over again, creating a lack of consistent therapeutic relationships. Additionally, there's still a huge stigma around mental health that if you're depressed or have anxiety, you're portrayed as crazy, according to Setanak. News reports confirm Nunavut's notoriously transient workforce, and according to the territory's representative for children and youth, the mental health infrastructure remains inadequate, unacceptable, and failing to meet the needs of young. These conditions did not arise naturally or accidentally. They constitute a direct legacy of colonial policies designed to disrupt and dismantle indigenous ways of life. Zimmerman and colleagues' systematic review of Arctic indigenous food system research reveals that established structures of settler colonialism persist in many aspects of indigenous life, hindering the attainment of a sovereign food system. The transition from traditional subsistence economies to cash-based economies occurred through forced means, including residential schools, relocations, and policies that systematically undermined traditional governance systems. Inuit researcher Makik, who conducted research in Clyde River, Nunavut, reflects on what she identifies as colonialization-induced intergenerational trauma. The pain of many is still so great. We have a lot to overcome. We, the younger generation, are realizing this, but we can't seem to cut off the pain, she says. This intergenerational trauma manifests in the elevated rates of substance abuse and suicide that plague Arctic communities. Setonok's lyrics capture his connection. Writing music didn't really seem to work for a while. Smoking weed was what kept forcing me to smile. Alcohol became part of my life, became dependent, she wrote. The systematic nature of colonial oppression becomes evident when examining who suffers most acutely. As M.P. Bukak observed, non-Indigenous residents of Nunavut do not face the same housing crises, mold exposure, or barriers to service. This disparity reflects what researchers term structural violence, whereby social structures systematically harm certain groups whilst protecting others. The poverty experienced by Inuit communities stems not from individual failings or unfortunate circumstances, but from deliberate policies and ongoing systemic marginalization. While historical colonialism created the conditions for contemporary Arctic poverty, climate change threatens to catastrophically worsen an already dire situation. The Arctic is warming at approximately twice the rate of the global average, fundamentally transforming the environment upon which indigenous communities depend. When asking whether changing environments connected to mental wellness, Setonok responded, "Yeah, I think it might in the future be Inuit still go hunting a lot to provide for their families, and without ice, Inuit can't travel across the land to hunt for seals or caribou. If one day there's no more ice, I don't know what Inuit are gonna do to provide for their families." This scenario is not speculative. Research documented by Duncan demonstrates that warmer temperatures can result in higher alcohol consumption due to stress, as well as increased suicide rates, and that climate change increases the likelihood that mental health care infrastructures will become increasingly challenging to access. The research shows that the process of climate-induced migration leads to higher prospects of exposure to a number of psychological and social risk factors which exacerbate the likelihood of developing mental health difficulties. Zimmerman and colleagues document how accelerating climate change places challenges on the environment from which indigenous communities derive much of their food. Examples include reduced accessibility of traditional resources as ice conditions on rivers, lakes, and seas becomes less predictable in Alaska, and higher temperatures jeopardizing food security through forest and tundra fires on lichen pastures in Russia, forcing reindeer herders to fundamentally alter their practices that they have practiced for centuries. The cruel irony cannot be overstated. Indigenous Arctic communities contributed virtually nothing to the greenhouse gas emission driving climate change. Their traditional subsistence practices remain sustainable for thousands of years. Yet they now face disproportionate consequences from a crisis created primarily by industrialized nations in the global south. This represents not merely environmental injustice, but a compounding of historical colonial injustices. The same communities stripped of economic and political power through colonialization now observe helplessly as their traditional food sources, travel routes, and ways of life disappear due to emissions from distant factories and cities. Confronted with these overwhelming challenges, Inuit communities have demonstrated remarkable resilience and creativity. Music and other cultural practices serve therapeutic functions whilst raising awareness about systemic issues. Setonok explains, "I think it's very therapeutic for me because I'm a very quiet person. I'm very laid back, and I don't really talk about how I feel inside. So it's like therapy. It's like talking to a counselor, in my opinion." Music therapist Warren notes additionally that research demonstrates music helps individuals with mental health issues and acts as a sort of medium for processing emotions, trauma, and grief. Community-based approaches also show promise. An Inuit non-for-profit organization director named Ronta explains that the need for the community to come together was the lack of mental health care in the community, when the only option involved visiting a health center to speak to a southern nurse who was very transient and only spoke English. Counselor Panalu highlights the importance of language. She states that we are more comfortable speaking in Inuit, not speaking in English. When I try to talk about the pain that we have, I prefer to talk about it in Inuit. It's like I'm able to release more of what I need to let go. However, Duncan emphasizes that the aim of this article is not to argue that music is a panacea. While music contributes to cultural and emotional well-being, it is evident that changes must be implemented on a systemic level, she states. Cultural practices cannot substitute for adequate housing, affordable nutritious food, accessible mental health care, or meaningful action on climate change. Celebrating Indigenous resilience without addressing structural inequities risks placing responsibility for solutions on the very communities suffering from injustices imposed upon them. Some may question why people far from the Arctic should prioritize these issues. Beyond basic human solidarity and moral obligations to address injustices, Arctic Indigenous poverty reveals critical truths about interconnected global crises. First, it demonstrates how climate change functions as a threat multiplier that exacerbates existing inequalities. The communities least responsible for emissions face the most severe consequences. This pattern repeats globally, with low-lying island nations such as Tuvalu, drought-prone African regions, and flood-vulnerable South Asian communities all facing disproportionate climate impacts despite minimal historical emissions. Second, Arctic Indigenous experiences expose how poverty cannot be understood through purely economic frameworks. Zimmerman and colleagues argue that Indigenous food systems are unique in that they are peculiarly defined through long-established sociocultural and ecological linkages that give rise to a context-specific culture intimately tied to the local environment. When poverty is only measured via income or consumption metrics, we overlook cultural dimensions central to human flourishing. Indigenous communities often maintain rich cultural practices, strong social networks, and deep connections to land, even whilst facing material deprivation. Conversely, increased cash income means little if it comes through losing traditional practices and severing relationships with the land. Third, this issue illuminates the ongoing nature of colonialism. Many perceive colonialism as historical, as something confined to the past and now concluded. Arctic Indigenous poverty reveals that colonial structures persist through policies, institutions, and above all, economic systems that continue extracting resources and wealth from Indigenous lands while providing inadequate services and maintaining political marginalization. Understanding this dynamic helps recognize similar patterns in other contexts where historical oppression shapes contemporary inequality. Addressing Arctic Indigenous poverty requires coordinated action at multiple levels. Most fundamentally, it requires recognizing Indigenous sovereignty and supporting self-determination. As Zimmerman and colleagues emphasize, there's no recognition that Indigenous communities need to exercise sovereignty over their food systems to improve Indigenous health and well-being and adaptability to current and future challenges, they stated. This means respecting Indigenous governance, supporting Indigenous-led solutions, and ensuring Indigenous communities possess decision-making power over policies affecting their land and their lives. Concretely, this necessitates substantial investment in infrastructure and services. Housing construction must be dramatically increased to address overcrowding and substandard conditions. Food security programs require expansion and redesign to support both affordable store-bought foods and traditional hunting, fishing, and gathering practices. Mental health services demand stable funding for locally based, culturally appropriate, Inuit-speaking counselors who can build long-term therapeutic relationships with community members. Climate action becomes not solely an environmental issue, but as well a poverty and justice imperative. Industrializations must dramatically reduce their emission output while providing substantial climate adaptation funding to Arctic communities. This includes supporting traditional knowledge documentation, funding community-led adaptation projects, and compensating communities for losses they face through no fault of their own. Zimmerman and colleagues' research review identifies three critical directions: decolonialization of research practices, acknowledging systemic interdependencies, and transdisciplinary, action oriented research collaboration. Applied beyond research, these principles require centering Indigenous voices in policymaking, recognizing how housing, food security, and mental health and climate change all interconnect rather than addressing them in silos, and fostering actual, genuine partnerships between Indigenous communities, governments, researchers, and service providers. Setzenach's lyrics pose urgent questions that indict not merely local conditions, but global systems that have dispossessed Indigenous peoples while warming the planet upon which they depend. How could I live here when I can't afford housing? How can I be healthy when the food is lousy? The poverty facing Arctic Indigenous communities stems from historical colonialism, persists through contemporary structural marginalization, and intensifies through climate change driven by emissions from distant industrial centers. This represents a profound moral failure demanding immediate action. We cannot claim to care about poverty while ignoring communities facing some of the highest rates of food insecurity, housing crises, and mental health challenges in the developed world. We cannot claim to address climate change while abandoning communities facing its most severe impacts despite bearing virtually no responsibility for causing it. We cannot claim to support Indigenous rights while maintaining systems that extract resources from Indigenous lands while simultaneously providing inadequate services and denying self-determination. The ice is melting. Traditional hunting routes are disappearing. Food sources are shifting. Communities that have thrived in the Arctic for thousands of years face existential threats. Their survival depends on our willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about colonialism, inequality, and climate injustice. More fundamentally, their experience reveals how environmental and economic justice are inseparable. The same systems that impoverish communities are destroying the planet. Addressing Arctic Indigenous poverty means confronting those systems and building alternatives rooted in justice, sustainability, and respect for Indigenous sovereignty. The question remains whether we will act with the urgency this crisis demands.